Good afternoon, evening, or morning, everyone, depending on where you are viewing this wonderful event from. We're delighted to welcome Sir Roderick Floud, an economic historian who's received a knighthood for his achievements in 2005. And he's applied his background in economics and population study and the health and welfare of populations and so forth to a study of English gardens, their effect on English society and landscapes, their economic potential. In fact, perhaps the importance of gardening to the economy is still understated. Any of you who have watched Monty Dunn in his half-hour programs on, I believe it's Friday night, will have seen how invested and interested gardeners are in England, the kinds of contests they have and the money involved. I particularly like Sir Roderick. I really loved the whole daffodil expedition and the truly sneaky ways that people went to achieve more renown with their daffodils and win prizes. But Sir Roderick and his wife, who live near Oxford, are avid gardeners. And so rather than writing an academic book, although certainly there's a lot of wonderful information in this, he has written a book for more popular consumption. So Sir Roderick, you're going to show us some slides, some photos of the gardens, as well as talk to us, yes?
Yes. Yes, Barbara, thank you very much for that introduction, and I'm very pleased to be talking to you. It's a pity that I can't be with you in Arizona. I've spent many holidays and work time in the United States, and particularly love the landscapes of the West. So it would be great to be in Arizona, but I'm going to talk today, as you suggested, about very different kind of landscapes, those of England, and in particular of the effect of gardens on the English landscape. The garden industry in England has created hundreds of magnificent gardens and has transformed, as you can see from this book title, it's become a billion-dollar industry which has transformed a nation from Charles II to today. There are over 1,500 gardens listed by the English government as worthy of preservation, and those are really only a relatively small part of the huge number of gardens in England, and of course they represent only those that have survived from the last 3 centuries of creation. But I thought I'd begin with a little taster of English gardens, some of my own favorites, which I'll then come back to in the course of the rest of the discussion, the presentation or talk. Firstly, this is, I think, one of the most beautiful scenes of the English garden. This is Restpark in Bedfordshire, about 50 miles north of London, and is now in the care of English Heritage, one of our major heritage organisations, because it's a particularly interesting garden, because instead of its owners sweeping away, as so many of them did, the efforts of their predecessors, in the case of Rest, they essentially just added new bits onto the garden, making it bigger and rounder, so that one has at Restpark a set of different gardening styles. But this is actually Restpark with the famous pavilion by Thomas Archer, a kind of banqueting house and pavilion in the garden, as it would have been in the middle of the 18th century. Then secondly, another tremendous garden, Paynes Hill, in the outskirts of London in this case. That's the creation, or was the creation from the 1730s onwards, of one man, Charles Hamilton, whom I'll talk about later. Unlike Rest, where the family continued to live in the garden and live in the house and work in the garden. Paynes Hill decayed after it was sold by Hamilton when he ran out of money. And it decayed for some centuries. Luckily, very luckily, it escaped the fate of many of the great houses, which is to be turned into housing developments. And it was rescued by a dedicated band of volunteers under the patronage of Prince Charles, the Prince of Wales, and as you can see, has been returned to its 18th century form. Then another great 18th century garden, Stour Head. This was built by a banker, not by an aristocrat. Most of the gardens are those of aristocrats, but he was a banker, although a pretty aristocratic one. And he built this garden between 1741 and 1780. It's in Wiltshire, about 100 miles west of London, and is really an extravaganza of gardening styles. It's an Arcadian landscape with classical allusions. It's got bridges, it's got temples, it's got grottos and statues all clustered around this beautiful lake. And then those first three are all 18th century gardens. Now one 19th century example, Waterston. Waterston, with its magnificent house, which you can see here, was built by Baron Ferdinand de Rothschild in the late 19th century. The Rothschild family, bankers, immensely wealthy bankers, built a series of houses, each with lavish gardens in Buckinghamshire, about 50 miles north of London. They liked hunting, and it was good hunting country. Here in this picture, you can see the Victorian, as it was, parterre with these hundreds of garish bedding plants, which have to be replaced regularly, sometimes 20, 30, 40,000 of them at times. Waterston itself is filled with art treasures collected by Baron Ferdinand and is one of my favourite places to visit. It's quite close to where I live. Now, as you can see from these four examples of England's great gardens, and there are, as I said, many, many more, they're beautiful, they're complex, and they're on a grand scale. It was while I was wandering round one of them, it's a long time ago, it was possibly Stour Head, that I thought to myself, this is marvellous, it's lovely, but how much did it cost? And I found, when I started to investigate, that none of the thousands of books on gardening, and garden design and garden history could give me an answer. So I set out to answer that question, how much did it cost, or how much did these gardens cost, for myself, and also to situate the gardens into the social and economic contexts within which they were produced. So to look at the importance of gardens to the English economy. And close to 2 decades later, this book on England's magnificent gardens, as it's the American title of the book, this book begins to answer that question. The simple summary answer, which I'll go on to elaborate, is that England's magnificent gardens cost a very great deal of money, both to make and to maintain. And this is for 3 main reasons. Firstly, they are very big, they're huge in some cases. Second, most of them are designed to look as if they're natural within the landscapes around them, but this is an artifice. The natural landscapes include, but often conceal deliberately, a vast amount of earth movement and a large amount of complicated technology. And that is also expensive. And thirdly, they employed, and still do employ, although to a much smaller extent actually, an awful lot of people. And that again meant that they were expensive to for their owners, who had to pay for the labour forces required to maintain them. So what I'd like to do is to illustrate these 3 points and then go on to talk about why they were built and where the money came from. First, size. This takes you back to Restpark, and you can see in the background here the Long Water, as it's called, the lake. This bird's eye view was taken, was drawn before the construction of the Archer Pavilion, which I showed you in the earlier picture, but the canal is still as it was, although now surrounded by trees. Britannia Illustrata, an amazing production in 1704 by two Dutch artists, Kip and Kniff, is an extraordinary production because, as you can see, it gives you a bird's eye view of the gardens at a time when nobody could see them like that. This is before the invention of balloons, and therefore there was no way in which anybody in the 18th century could have seen gardens looking like this. But all the evidence that we have is that they were actually extremely accurately produced by obviously surveying techniques and give us a really good picture of what the gardens looked like. Now, Restpark actually is quite a small garden by the standards of the great landscape gardens, but you can see the complex layout, the terracing, the formal parterre here between the house and the Long Water, and the Long Water itself, the lake, as it would now be called. It would have been called a canal at the time. Today, as a result of the accretions of the family over the centuries, the area around the Long Water at the top of the picture is now wooded. And there is actually a further lake built to resemble a river surrounding the woodland. Now, we don't know how much the lake, the Long Water, cost to dig, unfortunately, but we do know about the cost of the parterre behind the house in this plan, which cost the modern equivalent of $9.5 million to create in a period of about 20 years at the end of the 17th century. Let me give another example of the scale of these gardens. This is Chatsworth, the residence of the Duke of Devonshire, in the Derbyshire Hills, still one of the grandest and largest gardens in England, as it was at the beginning of the 18th century. And this is again from Kip and Kniff, the bird's eye view. But unlike Restpark, it's very different today. The Devonshire family continued to spend money, lots of money, on the gardens right through until the First World War. And they filled the hillsides. It's actually much more steeply wooded than steep inclines than you can really see from this picture. They filled the wooded sides of the valley with fountains, pools and lakes, and many reservoirs at the top in order for the water to pour off from the hills to power a great fountain and a number of other water features of the landscape. So you can see the scale of the gardens that were created and imagine the amount of gardening that has to go on in order both to build and then to maintain these extremely elaborate gardens. Here's another example. This shows you not a bird's eye view in this case, but an aerial view of Blenheim Palace and its sinuous lake. Blenheim Palace, it's the only house that isn't either a bishop's palace or a royal palace, which is allowed to use the title. Blenheim was built as a gift by the nation to the Duke of Marlborough, a very successful general at the beginning of the 18th century. And it had, when it was built, an elaborate garden to match with a rectangular canal, rather like that at Rest. But less than 60 years after that, a later Duke of Marlborough, the fourth Duke, employed England's greatest landscape architect, Lancelot Capability Brown, to transform the canal into this huge lake. It's 150 acres in extent. It took hundreds of men 6 years to waterproof its sides with layer upon layer of clay and other materials to make it waterproof, and then another 2 years to fill it with water from the stream that flows through it. And that cost £35 million, $49 million in modern values. Now, when I quote that kind of figure, $49 million, people look at me as if I'm mad. How can gardens cost so much? How can people spend so much on a garden? Well, the answer is because of the features that I'm describing, gardens are extremely expensive. And people do spend that amount of money on gardens. Just to take a recent example, the British Royal Horticultural Society, the main society for gardeners in Britain, has just spent exactly that same amount, $49 million, on a new show garden in Manchester, in the grounds of an old stately home. That garden is pretty big by modern standards. It's actually 150 acres, which is exactly the same, coincidentally, as the lake at Blenheim. But you can see that at Blenheim, the lake is only a small part of the park. This photograph doesn't even include the whole of the park. So if you're operating on the scale of the London and Wise, the architects and garden designers of the gardens and park of Blenheim in the 18th century, it's perfectly easy to see how you could be spending vast sums of money. The parks and gardens like these were very expensive because they were large civil engineering projects. And they were carried out, of course, with no mechanical aids. If you were going to dig out a lake or make a dam, then it had to be done by manpower and wheelbarrows as your only aid. Well, a spade and wheelbarrows. They're civil engineering projects on a large scale, on a vast scale, but most visitors to the gardens like this don't realize that. That's because the whole objective of their designers, men like Capability Brown and his contemporaries in the 18th century, was to make it all look natural. Most visitors are taken in. They don't realize that all the hundreds of lakes in England, south of our Lake District in Cumbria, are man-made. They were either made for the gardens or they were then later reservoirs, and more recently they've been created by filling gravel pits and other mineral extraction remains. So the lakes, this is why I say that gardening has transformed the English countryside, because it's given us the lakes, which are among the most loved features of the gardens. As I said, the whole objective is to make it look natural. If you look at the red square at the bottom of this this picture, you can see a white line going across it, a short white line, which is in fact the dam that holds back all the water. By the side of it, there's a cascade, which is entirely artificial, from which the river flows down to the south of the picture, the bottom of the picture. And the dam looks like this, and it's designed, as you can see, not to look like a dam at all. We're not talking about the Hoover Dam or something like that. These are essentially huge earth banks with within them water channels and sluices and weirs to allow for the control of the water. Blenheim's dam is only a few hundred yards long, as you can see here. Others were half a mile or more. Think of building something like this for half a mile, with soil which had to be carted to the site and rammed in place, mixed with clay, as I said, to make it impermeable. And there were many other illusions to make the gardens look natural. This is Paynes Hill as it was in 1760, and you can see the very important boating going on. These lakes had a number of different functions. They were designed to look beautiful and to create reflections. They were designed to hold fish, which were an important part of the diet, and they were useful for boating and other rural pursuits of the aristocracy. Paynes Hill, though, and it looks, as you can see, entirely natural within the landscape, but it isn't at all. The water for the lake has to be pumped up from a nearby river, which is 14 feet lower than the lake itself. So the water is entirely artificial. Originally, it was powered, there was a pump powered by a horse, which went round and round and round to pump up the water. Now it's powered by electricity. But it's all an illusion in a sense. It isn't a natural feature. And there's an even more extraordinary artificial but supposedly natural feature in the garden. This is a grotto, a feature of many of these gardens in the 18th century. Originally, they were features of the Renaissance gardens of Italy. This grotto is lined with a variety of sparkling minerals. It has wooden pillars embedded with crystals to form stalactites. Originally, a gardener was stationed within it, and his duty was to turn on an artificial waterfall to drench the unwary lady guests. It cost, in modern terms, $20 million to construct just this grotto within a garden which probably cost around $60 to $70 million. There were plenty of other bits of artifice in the Paynes Hill garden. There was a hermit's hut, which briefly housed a real paid hermit until he was discovered drinking in a local bar and summarily dismissed. So there are many illusions in these gardens. Here is another one. This is Kenwood, the 18th century house of Lord Mansfield in North London, in Hampstead, at the north of Hampstead Heath. This is a sham bridge, which again conceals the dam at the eastern end of the lake. I referred earlier to the amount of soil that had to be shifted in order to make these gardens. And this is another example. This is going back to Waterston, where in the second half of the 19th century, Baron Ferdinand decided that he was going to take off the top of a hill to provide a flat site for his fabulous house. He took 10 feet of soil off about 12 acres of the top of a hill. He then went on to establish an elaborate system of water pipes concealed behind huge mounds of artificial rockwork and under the gardens in order to water the gardens and to power its fountains. And again, one is talking about an expenditure on the garden of perhaps $60 to $70 million in the last quarter of the 19th century. There are other forms of technology in the gardens which most people don't appreciate, or don't appreciate how significant they were. Technology has always been an important part of garden making, but here is an example of a technology which was developed by gardeners for gardeners, which has had even more momentous consequences than the building of lakes and dams. It's gardens that gave us central heating in our houses and our workplaces. This English gardeners in the 17th century soon found that the much prized plants, such as oranges and lemon trees, or some of the plants that began to be imported into Britain from the Americas in the 17th century, these plants were ill-suited in many cases to the English climate, particularly plants obviously coming from the Mediterranean. They died when transplanted to England. They had to be shielded from the cold, normally originally by being moved during the winter into greenhouses. They're called greenhouses because the trees, oranges and lemon trees and similar trees, were known as the greens. But you couldn't, but even moving trees, which was not an easy task, sometimes you actually had to later on to build railways to move the trees into the temporary railways to move the trees into the greenhouses for the winter. But they soon realized that greenhouses had to be provided with light in the form of large windows and heat in the form of furnaces. And this is an example of an attempt designed, we think, by the great diarist John Evelyn, at his house in the 1690s to solve the problem of providing heat. The problem really is that unless you very carefully construct a system of heating, if you use open fires or you use boilers, there is a danger of doing two things. The first is to poison the plants, but you might also, and they did on occasion, poison the gardeners. So you had to have a system, which is what you can see here, of a separate boiler with pipes and firstly large bore pipes and then later on small bore pipes to circulate the heat around the greenhouse. And this is the origin of the central heating or the hot water systems or the hot air systems in our houses today. This was a time, remember, when people, much less important than the plants, were shivering in their houses or being warmed by wood or coal flowers. And the creation of greenhouses gave rise over the next 2 or 3 centuries to both the spreading technology and also to some rather delightful and beautiful buildings. This, for example, is the Orangery at Kensington Palace in the garden now that the home near the home of Prince William and Princess Catherine. It's now a restaurant rather than part of the Royal Palace, but still a very beautiful building. And you can see here that you've got relatively small windows in the style of the time. By the later part of the 18th century, you move on to another very beautiful building at Warwick Castle, the conservatory, the home originally of the Warwick vase, one of the most spectacular pieces of Roman sculpture in Britain, in a British collection. And this greenhouse cost about $3 million to build. But things then got bigger and bigger and bigger. This is the conservatory at Carlton House, originally the home of Frederick, Prince of Wales, the son of George II. Later, this was it was the residence of the heirs to the throne until the 1820s. You can see this extraordinarily elaborate conservatory built for the plants, although there don't actually seem to be any in this picture. But it had a defect, which is that actually there isn't a great deal of light coming into it. And that had to be remedied by the construction of greenhouses with really large amounts of glass, of light coming through glass. And this is, as you can see, the great stove at Chatsworth, built by Joseph Paxton, who was later designer of the Crystal Palace used for the Great Exhibition in London in 1851. It was so large, as you can see from this picture, I think, that Queen Victoria was able to drive through it in her carriage. And it cost $36 million to build. It used tons of coal each year to heat. They had to be brought to the greenhouse through a tunnel so that the guests at Chatsworth shouldn't see the gardeners or the stokers at work. And that happened in a number of country houses, a very expensive way of concealing your workforce from your visitors. But you can see that it was an enormous construction and used a phenomenal amount of coal to heat, so much so that even the Duke of Devonshire at the time of the First World War thought enough was enough, and unfortunately the stove was demolished. So the point I'm making is lots of money, lots of technological innovation, lakes, dams, central heating, and in an example here, a great stove at Chatsworth, glass buildings framed by wood, in this case later on metal, which are the forerunners of the skyscrapers and the glass-clad buildings which adorn, one might say, many cities today. So gardening again is responsible for some really major technological innovations which have transformed our society, our economy, and our towns and cities. In addition, of course, they needed a lot of people. We don't have many pictures of working gardeners, but these are the men and boys and the horses who looked after Restpark early in the 20th century. Many stately homes employed a far larger workforce, up to 100 in some cases were employed in the pleasure gardens and the kitchen gardens and the parks. And the head gardener of a place like Restpark, or certainly Blenheim or Chatsworth, would control a budget of $1 million or more in today's prices. I don't know how many of you were addicted, as so many people were in this country, to the aristocratic soap opera called Downton Abbey. But one of the I read recently that our Queen enjoyed seeing Downton Abbey and pointing out all the errors in it. One of the errors in the drama of Downton Abbey is that there's no sign of a head gardener, whereas in fact the head gardener would have been as important to the running of the household as the housekeeper, who does play or did play a major part in that drama. And the head gardener was an important person and seen to be such. I'll come back to him in a minute. So gardens, the great gardens of Britain, were expensive, lavish, large, and very influential on our landscape and our society. Now let me just turn for a bit to the question, why and who paid? Why did they build them? Well, it's thought that there were 300 to 400 estates, each of 10,000 acres or more, in 18th century England. And each of them would have had a great garden. That's because gardening was, in this period, regarded as an essential part of the aristocratic life of the time. Part of the reason lies with this man, Charles II, our king from 1660 to 1685, after the interregnum following the Civil War and the execution of his father, Charles I. Charles II was a keen garden builder. He came back to the throne in 1660, took up the throne in 1660, and one of the first things he did was to order the digging of a canal, rather like that at Rest, a bit longer, in St James's Park, linking the Palace of Whitehall, where now the Houses of Parliament are, with what later became Buckingham Palace. Other gardens followed. King James II, his brother, and his successors, King William and Queen Mary, were even keener. And they and their Georgian successors spent literally billions of dollars in modern values on the gardens surrounding their palaces. Those are now the royal parks, which are some of London's greatest ornaments. And Charles II, James II, William and Mary set the fashion which the English aristocracy were quick to follow. The American economist Thorstein Veblen coined the phrase conspicuous consumption to describe spending designed to show off one's wealth. And to men like Henry Grey, Duke of Kent, who was the creator of the gardens at Restpark, or one of the creators of the gardens at Restpark, and to hundreds of others, building spectacular gardens was the ultimate form of conspicuous consumption, because it showed off both your wealth, which was very considerable, and your taste. Gardening in the 17th and 18th centuries was regarded as an art, on a par with poetry or literature or drama. And it was one in which you could demonstrate your taste by the number of classical illusions which you installed into your garden, the number of temples and statues, and by the design of the garden in accordance with the tenets of the time. And it was very important. It's very important to remember that gardening is a fashion industry, very much prone to fashions changing from decade to decade almost. Henry Grey was extremely wealthy because he'd inherited quite a lot of land, but also because he was paid millions of dollars in modern values by the British state. The government, the British government, is extremely important in the creation of the English garden industry, both because the royal family, with government money, with taxpayers' money, created so many beautiful gardens, but also because people like Henry Grey made millions of money from posts at the royal court, sinecures in most cases, with very few duties, which paid nevertheless extremely well. And Charles Hamilton, the creator of Paynes Hill, as I showed you earlier, was another one of them. He actually, unlike Henry Grey, Charles Hamilton had very little inherited money. He was the youngest or nearly youngest son of an impecunious Irish peer, but he had very powerful friends. He'd been to the right schools, and they got him a series of court and government appointments, which we can calculate brought him in $60 million or more during his lifetime. This is sometimes described, this system of government posts and sinecures is sometimes described as the old corruption. But it wasn't by any means the only source of the funds that people used to spend on gardens. This, for example, is Harwood House, the creation of slavery, slave trading and slave ownership. Here you see it in its Victorian splendor. It also has a large lake, gorgeous water gardens, and a huge kitchen garden. Other sources of funds which created these houses and gardens were India, where numerous servants of the East India Company made fabulous sums, and service in the armed services. Naval captains got prize money. Army generals could skim off the money that they were given to pay for the troops or to buy supplies. This was all regarded entirely legitimate at the time, and was a major source of the funds for these great gardens. And then finally, if all else fails, there was marriage. The English aristocracy jealously guarded their privileges in the 18th century and their blue blood, as it was called, but they made an exception if presented with the opportunity to marry an heiress, even if her father was a brewer or a banker. And the tradition started early in the 18th century, 17th century, and before, but reached a climax in the 19th century when American heiresses came onto the marriage market. And this is one of the perhaps most beautiful, certainly one of the most famous of those heiresses, Consuela Vanderbilt, the unwilling teenage bride of the 9th Duke of Marlborough, owner of Blenheim. She was coerced into marrying the 9th Duke by her mother, who resorted to locking Consuela in her room and threatening to murder the American boy to whom she'd secretly become engaged. Consuela finally gave in, and her father, the railroad king William Vanderbilt, transferred $642 million in modern values to her new husband, the 9th Duke. The marriage was entirely unsuccessful. They had 2 children but lived apart for most of the time. But the money served its purpose, rescuing the fortunes of Blenheim Palace, and in particular helping to create the Italian garden, standing on a terrace high above the lake, which I showed you earlier on. So the great gardens were paid for by a small group of extremely wealthy people following the lead of the royal family. And they were, of course, at the pinnacle of a very, very unequal society. They were expected, as I said, to be men of taste and discernment. Um, Many of them had travelled in their youth to on the so-called Grand Tour of France and Italy. They'd seen the great gardens of the Villa d'Este outside Rome or the Palace of Versailles, and they came home, returned home with their treasures and showed it off by demonstrating, by creating the beautiful gardens which we've been looking at. They spent money on gardens because they could, and in fact, in most cases, there were a few cases where they overspent on the gardens and in some cases actually bankrupting themselves, but mostly it was a small part of their expenditure, and it was one which was expected of them and demonstrated their good taste. It also enabled them to compete. They could compete for the first to show off an American magnolia or a Chinese rhododendron or a South American lily, or they wanted to outdo their fathers. But of course, they didn't do it on their own. I've concentrated on the owners, but there were others. There were the great garden designers, Henry Wise, Lancelot Brown, and Joseph Paxton, among the most famous of all. And these designers were at the peak of what I've called the garden industry, with thousands of nurserymen, seedsmen, gardeners, great and small. And it's an industry now worth $15 billion a year in my country, in the UK. But it's been very complex and very profitable from the 17th century or before. Uh, all these men died as multimillionaires, having made their money. All of them are from what used to be called humble origins. They made their money from gardening. Brown alone was responsible for projects worth about $1.5 billion during the course of his career, and he made a substantial amount from that. The garden industry was based for many years in and around London, and this shows the gardens at the Vauxhall Nursery in London in around 1860. And it was in London for a good reason, based in London for a good reason, because it's a fashion industry, as I said earlier on, selling its goods to its rich and influential customers where they could be found, which was often for part of the year in London. The aristocracy danced at balls, attended Parliament, went to the theatre, and shopped at garden centres. Nurseries now call them garden centres, which were one of their favourite destinations. So they then shipped the plants which they bought to their, no doubt, rather alarmed gardeners back home. And one of those gardeners I'd like to end with, this is William Coleman, who, like many of these gardeners, began work at the age of 15 as a garden boy, and at 16 was sent away to work as an apprentice. He would have lived in what was called a bothy, a rudimentary lodging house, often set against the wall of a kitchen garden, the north wall outside the kitchen garden when nothing much would grow. He had to learn the names of plants, despite only having been educated up to the age of 15 or often younger. He had to learn Latin names of plants. He had to learn how to grow them, nurture them. He had to, in Coleman's case, be in charge of greenhouses, keeping them at a constant temperature. And then he had to become a specialist, as he did, in fruit growing in the great country house, which he became the head gardener before his death. And he's another person who made millions out of gardening. He left about 3 million in modern values $3 million in modern values at his death in 1908. Now, you've been very patient. I hope you, while I've described some of the features of the book, I haven't had a chance to talk about a lot of things that are in the book. I haven't explained how gardens were among the earliest users of the first steam engines. I've said nothing about the growth of the suburban gardens which surround our towns and cities in England. I haven't, except in passing, about the great walled kitchen gardens which so delight visitors today. I haven't described the eating habits of the royal family, which I do discuss in the book. But I hope I've given you a taste of a subject which I've enormously enjoyed studying, and I hope you read my book and enjoy it as well. Thank you very much, Barbara.
Well, you're entirely welcome. Can you hear me?
I can indeed, yes.
I seem to have disappeared. Our internet connection went down and I have hastily joined on my phone. And therefore, I may just be a voice rather than a picture. Patrick, can you fix that, or am I just going to talk out of the dark?
Yeah, we can see you
We
actually.
can see you just fine, Barbara.
Good, okay, I can't see me. That's the only reason I asked. Great. Well, then I did compile a list of 5 places, gardens that I think contribute greatly to different economies, all of which I have visited and enjoyed, and I wanted to mention them to Sir Roderick. First one on my list is Glyndebourne, which is in the south of England near Lewes.
Sorry,
And,
I didn't catch that. Sorry.
sorry, it's Glyndebourne.
Glyndebourne, yeah. Mm.
In the south near Lewes, and the gardens are in fact the scene of the opera house that was built there, which from my first visit to my second visit was torn down and replaced with a much more modern building. But
Yeah.
a feature of going to the opera at Glyndebourne is to picnic during the long intermission out in the gardens on the lawn. It's a famous sort of British thing to have strawberries on the lawn and so forth. But the amount of money that's generated by Glyndebourne for people staying in hotels, eating in the restaurants and so forth is enormous. The second one that I particularly like is Sissinghurst, which was built by the daughter of a larger house at Knoll, who was illegitimate and could not inherit. And she and her husband, Sir Harold Macmillan. It's a fascinating exercise in garden design. But what I think, Sir Roderick, is really interesting about Sissinghurst, because it's a huge visitor attraction, is its restaurant. And as a consequence, so there's a wonderful book written by one of the family members, which I have over here, I can't see it at the moment, is that they supply the restaurant with food and everything grown in the whole area. So
Yeah.
the garden, the house, the restaurant, again, become a major economic engine, which I imagine was shut down during COVID, but will probably restart. It is one of my very favorite places. Gravtime here, not too far away, is another place that I love. It's small. It was built in 1598, and in 1958, it was transformed into a hotel and a very well-known restaurant. It has a great kitchen garden. I've stayed there several times. It has a small lake, not like your Longwater, but it's a lovely place to visit. And many of these homes and gardens have in fact been transformed into paying hotels, most often with restaurants. So again, a major employer. And the last one on my list is Grey Walls, which is up in Scotland at Muirfield. It has a garden designed by Gertrude Jekyll, who's quite a famous 20th century garden designer. It's a lovely place to stay, and the engine around it is golf, because people like to stay at Grey Walls who are on golf tours or playing at Muirfield, which is one of the champion courses. So I do think that all of those are really interesting. A garden I recommend just for love is Bodmin, which is in North Wales near the town of Conway. And I think, I'm trying to remember, Sir Roderick, is Bodmin noted for its laburnum or for its wisteria? It has a very famous walk.
I can't remember. And I have to confess that I ignored both Wales and Scotland and Ireland for the purposes of the book, not because they haven't got marvelous gardens like the ones you're referring to, but simply because the amount of information about the gardens was just overwhelming. I mean, people, you're quite right that these gardens have all kinds of different economic effects on the areas that surround them. And but the amount of research that was involved meant that I had to limit myself to exploring about 6 English counties. So there's far more to be said in the way that you have said it about the economic impact and the social impact of these gardens. One of the extraordinary things about the great families of the 18th century is that they were very, very assiduous record keepers. They kept absolutely voluminous, detailed records of their expenditure down to the nearest farthing, which was the smallest of bits of the English currency at the time. And therefore, if you have the patience and time, you can reconstruct the spending patterns of the English aristocracy of the 18th century. All the butcher's bills, all the expenditure on doctors, all the expenditure on different forms of food, on their horse racing, on their betting, etc., all can be found in the records of some of these stately homes. And that's the basis for my statement earlier on that they had so much money. The gardens are usually a relatively small part of what they spent, but it was certainly still an awful lot of money. So yeah, I agree with you about those marvelous gardens. There's another one near me, Wormsley, in the Chilterns, which is another bit of American money coming to this country and creating a garden, which is the Getty family have created there. Also the site of one of the great open air or semi-open air operas houses of England. Yeah, lots of ramifications.
Oh, they do. We have some American equivalents. I could name maybe just 3 for our audience. One would be Winterthur, which is the wonderful DuPont Gardens in Delaware. And another would be Biltmore House, built by yet a different scion of the Vanderbilt family in Asheville, North Carolina, that has its own dairy and so forth, and is again just a tremendous employer in the area. And the third is in Inside California in a garden called Filoli, which I went to Stanford, and so I used to visit it before it became so well known. But I wanted to end with going back to Bodnett, something I thought you might enjoy, sir, because there's no way you would know this. But Bodnett is near Conwy, which is the site of one of the great English castles, the Welsh Marcher castles that are kind of in ruins. And Bodnett brings a lot of visitors, including me. And I went in to spend a day visiting the castle, which I loved. And I took a break. And I remember sitting on the castle walls, munching on an apple or something, and kind of kicking my heels. And there was a very nice man who came and sat down beside me. And we started talking about the castle. And he asked why I was there. I said I was visiting the gardens. And he said, it's a wonderful thing, he said, that this garden brings so many people here. He said, I am the master mason responsible for the walls and the upkeep of the castle. And he said, it's tremendously hard to get enough funding. But the worst problem, he said, is that very few young people are interested in learning my craft. And I may therefore be, among the last, well, there'll have to be another one, Master Mason. But I love that interplay of Bodnett, a relatively, modern garden, bringing people to this ancient city in North Wales. So, and helping support the work of the master stonemason, keeping the castle going. And I think that's one of the things that's so fascinating about these gardens, large and small, is that the many of the economic benefits to the whole surrounding community are not obvious at all. You really have to focus on track them. And I certainly understand the focus of your book and why, again, you couldn't embrace the vast number of gardens and houses that were there. But I think it's fascinating to think about them, not just in terms of their beauty and their horticultural significance. And, at Waterston, I remember, I think Baron Rothschild sent people out like to the Himalayas to find hitherto undiscovered orchids and plants and other things and brought them back, so he funded a whole raft of people traveling to bring him back. He is the right to Rothschild, right, that did that?
Yeah. It was actually his sister, Alistair Rothschild, who was a particularly great gardener. And she had what the Rothschilds described as the most lavish, extravagant garden ever produced, which was in the south of France. So she had Waterston plus the Villa Victoria in the south of France. Yeah, I mean, I think you're entirely right. The ramifications are considerable. And I think what is sad in a sense, and it goes back to your master mason unable to get somebody to succeed him, is that the fact that people don't appreciate how important the garden industry is, what a big part it is of the English economy, means that it's not seen as a great career for people. So we not only have a shortage of masons, I'm sure, but we also at the moment have a shortage of gardeners. And that's really sad because gardening has proved during the COVID crisis to be one of the things that keeps people alive and happy. So that's another benefit of the gardens.
It truly is. Actually, there's been quite a lot of publicity here about the health benefits of gardening, that you get exercise and fresh air and so forth. So, one hopes going forward that that gardens will thrive and these historic gardens will be preserved. It's really been fascinating listening to you. Thank you so much. And I love your book, which has arrived here at the Poison Pen. You saw, here it is here, the amazing cover. And the cover comes from it's a catalog, isn't it? An illustration from the catalog?
Yeah, it's a catalogue from Sutton's, one of the great seedsmen. And these are tulips, obviously, but it's a catalogue, yeah.
Well, it's wonderful. So thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate all of you who watched us today. And I wish you a very happy good afternoon or good evening.
Good evening, and thank you very much. I've enjoyed it.